Right now in Kentucky, there are more bourbon barrels aging in the state than there are people living in it. The ground in some eastern counties is literally hollow from unmapped coal tunnels and sinking overnight. Asian carp have so completely overtaken every major waterway that the state holds tournaments just to remove them, and it has not made a measurable difference. A farming family near Kelly fired shotguns through their windows for 3 hours at something that kept coming back after being shot. 11 witnesses. An Air Force investigation. No explanation. These are 25 of the strangest things happening in Kentucky right now, and fair warning, the closer you look, the harder it gets to believe you are still talking about the Bluegrass State. Coming in at number 25, Bourbon County, Kentucky. The place. Bourbon whiskey was literally invented and named after, has completely banned alcohol sales since Prohibition. It never reversed the decision. The most famous product in Kentucky history cannot be legally purchased in the county that gave it its name. You can visit the birthplace of bourbon and leave empty-handed, legally speaking. That's a contradiction that only exists because Kentucky doesn't do irony. It does paradox. At number 24, Kentucky produces 95% of the world's bourbon, and right now there are approximately 12 million barrels aging across the state. Kentucky's population is roughly 4.5 million people. That means there are nearly 3 barrels of bourbon for every single person living in Kentucky. You are outnumbered by whiskey. The barrels are winning, and unlike the people, the barrels are only increasing in value. Landing at number 23 in March 2026, Kentucky's House voted to impeach a sitting judge. The Supreme Court ruled 5-1 that the impeachment violated separation of powers and ordered the proceedings to end. The Senate said they would proceed with the trial anyway. Both chambers then censured the Supreme Court justice who had warned them that threatening judges is a crime, and the Legislative Research Commission filed a formal complaint against him with the Judicial Conduct Commission. Senate President Robert Stivers called the Supreme Court ruling an encroachment on the Senate's constitutional responsibility. One political analyst said, "We are in unprecedented waters here. The crisis is not over. The Senate can take it up again next session." Fact 22. Hundreds of miles of unmapped coal tunnels sit beneath eastern Kentucky. The ground in some counties is literally hollow. Roads crack and entire yards drop overnight with no warning. Homeowners have no legal recourse because the coal companies that caused it are mostly bankrupt or gone. The same surface mining operations are directly linked to the catastrophic floods that devastated eastern Kentucky in 2022. The land is collapsing from below and flooding from above, and no one is coming to fix it. Number 21. Asian carp have so completely overtaken Kentucky's major waterways that the fish now jump into boats and injure fishermen. The Big Sandy River, the Ohio River, and every major system are overrun. The state holds removal tournaments to thin the population. It hasn't made a measurable difference. The carp reproduce faster than humans can catch them. The invasion isn't slowing down, it's accelerating. What was supposed to be a containment effort has become a documentation of failure. At number 20, Fort Knox currently stores 147.3 million troy ounces of gold, worth over $589 billion at today's market price of $4,000+ per ounce. The official U.S. government book value is still locked at $42.22 per ounce, a number that has not changed since 1973. The gold was last publicly viewed in 2017 by Treasury Secretary Mnuchin, Governor Matt Bevin, and a handful of members of Congress. Before 1974, only one president, FDR, was ever personally allowed inside, and journalists were first permitted entry only to stop rumors that the gold had been removed. The vault door weighs more than 20 tons. No public access. President Trump said in May 2026 he would still like to see it. Landing at number 19. Mammoth Cave is the longest known cave system on Earth, with over 426 mapped miles. Scientists believe it extends much further. New passages are still being discovered. Nobody knows where it actually ends. It is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and the deeper explorers go, the more it seems to branch and twist and refuse to offer a boundary. Kentucky is sitting on top of a system so vast that after decades of mapping, we still do not have an edge. Number 18. In Warren County, an entire river called Lost River literally vanishes into the ground and reappears 8 miles away. During Prohibition, it operated as an underground speakeasy. Then it became an underground nightclub. During World War II, it was used as a secret military research site, all underground. The river is still there. The cavern is still there. A waterway that disappears into the earth and comes back miles later, and humans built a bar inside it. Fact number 17. Cumberland Falls produces a moonbow, a rainbow made purely by moonlight, visible only on clear full moon nights. It is one of only 2 places on Earth where this happens. The other is Victoria Falls in Africa. Almost no Americans have heard of it. You can stand in Kentucky and watch light refract through mist under conditions so rare that most of the planet will never see it, and it does not make the national news. The phenomenon requires a full moon, a clear sky, and falling water at the exact angle. It exists in Kentucky, and it remains almost completely unknown. At number 16, Kentucky has more miles of navigable waterways than any state except Alaska. It's almost entirely surrounded by rivers, the Mississippi, the Ohio, the Cumberland, and the Tennessee. Most people picture Kentucky as landlocked mountain country. It's not. It's defined by water. More navigable river miles than Florida, Louisiana, or Washington. Only Alaska has more. The state is a network of channels and tributaries that shaped its economy, its history, and its geography, and the public perception still hasn't caught up. Number 15. Kentucky has surpassed $1 billion in opioid settlements from pharmacies, distributors, and manufacturers. Attorney General Russell Coleman has secured nearly $900 million, with over $55 million already awarded in grants across the state. Eastern Kentucky has some of the highest overdose death rates in the nation. More than 100,000 Americans are still dying every year from overdoses nationally, most from fentanyl. The money is flowing in. The grants are being distributed, and people are still dying at the same rate. The settlements arrived too late to stop the crisis. They are funding the cleanup of a disaster that is still unfolding. At number 14 in the 1930s, Harlan County was the site of a literal war between coal companies and union organizers. Workers were shot on courthouse steps in broad daylight. The federal government sent troops 3 separate times without resolving anything. It was called Bloody Harlan nationally for decades. Today, it is still one of the poorest counties in America. The violence ended, the national attention moved on, and the poverty that sparked the war never left. The coal ran out, the companies disappeared, and Harlan stayed behind. Fact 13. In the 1940s, the Tennessee Valley Authority, the TVA, deliberately flooded thousands of acres of Kentucky farmland to create Kentucky Lake and Lake Barkley. Entire communities were forced to relocate. The submerged towns, roads, and cemeteries are still down there. On low water days, you can see foundations beneath the surface. The federal government decided the electricity and flood control were worth more than the towns, gave residents notice to leave and let the water rise. What is underneath did not disappear. It is preserved, waiting under however many feet of water that the TVA decides to hold back that year. Number 12. In 1972, a dam built by a Kentucky coal company burst in 125 seconds and killed 125 people downstream in West Virginia. The company called it an act of God. They paid $1 million in total settlements, less than $8,000 per victim. Executives faced 0 criminal charges. The dam was built from mining waste and coal slurry. It collapsed during a rainstorm, and the company that built it walked away calling it divine intervention. A structure made by human hands, maintained by a corporation, failed because it was never safe to begin with. That is not an act of God. That is a crime no one was held accountable for. Landing at number 11. The 1921 Battle of Blair Mountain was the largest armed labor uprising in American history since the Civil War, organized and funded largely from Kentucky coalfields. The federal government dropped bombs on American citizens on American soil. Private planes hired by coal companies flew overhead and dropped explosives on miners fighting for the right to unionize. Federal troops were deployed to suppress the rebellion. It's almost never taught in schools. Somewhere between 50 and 100 people died. The exact number was never confirmed, and most of the country has never heard the name Blair Mountain. The government bombed its own people to protect corporate profit, and it happened less than 100 years ago. At number 10, Bramwell, on the Kentucky and West Virginia border, was once the wealthiest town per capita in the entire United States. More millionaires per square mile than anywhere in America. Coal money built mansions, imported marble, and funded a town that rivaled the richest cities on the East Coast. Now it is almost entirely abandoned. The coal ran out, the money left, and Bramwell became a ghost town lined with decaying monuments to wealth that evaporated the moment the industry collapsed. You can walk through it today and see what happens when an entire economy is built on something that does not last. Number 9. Waverly Hills Sanatorium in Louisville was so overwhelmed with tuberculosis deaths in the 1940s that staff built a 500-foot underground tunnel specifically to remove bodies without patients seeing them. They called it the death chute. At peak capacity, there was roughly 1 death every single day. The tunnel was not a backup plan. It was standard operating procedure. Doctors knew that watching bodies get carried out would destroy whatever hope patients had left, so they built infrastructure around the certainty of mass death. The tunnel is still there. The hospital closed in 1961, but the chute remains. A concrete admission that the building was designed not just to treat disease, but to hide how often it failed. Number 8. The Kentucky Derby has run continuously since 1875. Through both world wars, through the Great Depression, through the 1918 flu pandemic and COVID-19. It is the longest continuously held major sporting event in American history. Louisville was under threat during World War II. The economy collapsed in the 1930s, and the country shut down twice for disease. None of it stopped the Derby. The race happened in May 1945 while American soldiers were still dying in Europe. It happened in 2020 with empty stands and postponed by months, but it happened. The consistency isn't tradition anymore, it's defiance. Kentucky decided a long time ago that the Derby does not stop, and a century and a half later, it still has not. Landing at number 7. The stretch of the Ohio River running through Kentucky is one of the most industrially contaminated waterways in America. Decades of chemical plant runoff from companies, including DuPont, have left sediment that scientists describe as essentially permanent. The contamination didn't wash away. It sank and bonded with the riverbed. Dredging won't remove it. time won't dilute it. The pollutants are embedded at the molecular level in the substrate, meaning the river bottom itself is toxic. Communities along the Ohio have been drinking, fishing, and living next to a waterway that carries a chemical archive of every industrial shortcut taken over the last century. The companies that caused it moved on. The river didn't. Number 6. In the 2026 legislative session, Kentucky lawmakers promised to regulate energy-guzzling AI data centers to protect utility rate payers from bearing the cost of supplying electricity to hyperscale facilities. The provision was stripped from the bill before it cleared both chambers. Ratepayers now have no protection. The data centers can pull as much power as they need, and the public will absorb the cost through higher utility rates. Mason County is already facing controversy over a proposed facility. The legislature had the chance to draw a line, wrote the language, then deleted it before the vote. That's not a compromise. That's a decision to let corporations externalize their operating costs onto residential electric bills. Chapter 21. Fact 5. The Axeman of New Orleans sent his famous letter in 1919, threatening to kill anyone who did not play jazz. The murders actually began in Kentucky months earlier. The same method, chiseled door panels, the same entry pattern, the same weapon. That connection was never officially investigated. The New Orleans killings became infamous, studied, mythologized. The Kentucky attacks were barely documented. No one drew the line between them until long after the case went cold. Either the Axeman traveled north to south and no one noticed, or someone in Kentucky was using the same playbook before the letters ever arrived in Louisiana. The timeline exists. The crime scenes match. No investigation ever linked them. Number 4. In 1921, 2 men in Corbin, Kentucky, flagged down a car on a dark road and robbed the driver at gunpoint. It was so novel that newspapers did not know what to call it. There was no term for it yet. No precedent. It became the first recorded American drive-through robbery. Cars had only been common for a few years, and criminals were still figuring out how to use them. This was not a bank heist or a train holdup. It was something new, a crime that required the technology to exist first. The men saw an opportunity that had not existed a decade earlier, and they took it. They made history by accident, inventing a category of crime that would define the next century. Number 3. Wycliffe Mounds is a 1,000-year-old native city on the Mississippi River with UNESCO consideration level significance. Almost no Americans outside Kentucky have heard its name. The site preserves the remains of a Mississippian culture settlement that thrived between 1100 and 1350 AD, a complex urban center with platform mounds, residential areas, and trade networks stretching across the continent. Archaeologists have documented advanced agricultural systems, ceremonial structures, and evidence of a population that sustained itself for generations on the edge of one of North America's most important waterways. The city existed for longer than the United States has, and it remains almost completely absent from the national historical narrative. It is not hidden. It is open to the public, but it occupies the same cultural blind spot that erases most pre-colonial American history. A millennium-old city on the Mississippi, and most of the country does not know it is there. At number 2, in 1921, Corbin, Kentucky, became the site of what newspapers described as America's first drive-through robbery. 2 men flagged down a car on a dark road and held the driver at gunpoint. The crime was so novel that reporters didn't have language for it yet. There was no existing term, no precedent in the criminal record. Cars had only become common a few years earlier, and the legal system was still catching up to what motorized transportation made possible. This wasn't an adaptation of train robbery or highway banditry. It was a new category of crime that required the technology to exist first. The men who did it weren't innovators in any intentional sense, but they accidentally invented a blueprint that would define American crime for the next century. Carjackings, drive-bys, every roadside holdup since. It all traces back to two men in Kentucky who saw an opportunity that had not existed a decade earlier and took it. Landing at number 1, on August 21st, 1955, the Sutton family near Kelly, Kentucky, barricaded themselves inside their farmhouse and fired shotguns through the windows for 3 hours. They were firing at small, glowing, claw-handed creatures that kept returning after being shot. 11 family members witnessed it. They called the police. The United States Air Force investigated. The case was never explained. Every witness maintained the exact same account until they died, never selling their story, never seeking fame, never changing a single detail across 40 years of interviews. The Air Force file exists. The witness statements exist. Multiple independent witnesses corroborated the timeline. The farmhouse is still there. What visited that farm on the night of August 21st, 1955 has never been identified. That is not folklore. That is an open investigation that closed without an answer. Kentucky does not just hide its strangeness underground or behind courthouse doors. Sometimes it happens in the open, with witnesses, with investigators, with documentation, and it still does not make sense. The Air Force file exists. The witness statements exist. The farmhouse is still there, just like the hollow ground, the constitutional crisis, and the 12 million barrels aging in warehouses across a state that will not sell bourbon in the county that named it. These are not legends from 100 years ago. The Supreme Court censure happened in April. The data center bill was stripped this session. The carp are jumping into boats right now. Kentucky is producing more whiskey than it has people to drink it, sitting on more gold than most countries will ever see, and holding removal tournaments for an invasive species that is winning. The moonbow still appears at Cumberland Falls on clear full moon nights. The Lost River still vanishes into the earth and comes back 8 miles later. The Ohio River sediment is not going anywhere. And somewhere in eastern Kentucky, the ground is still sinking. This is Kentucky in 2026, not the version they teach in schools, not the postcard image of horse farms and bluegrass, but the version that exists when you actually look at what is happening right now. The closer you look, the stranger it gets. And the strangest part? Most of the country has no idea. If you want more of the wildest, most unbelievable facts happening across America, subscribe, because Kentucky is not the only state hiding things this strange. Comment below, which fact hit you hardest? I am Ethan, and I will see you in the next one.